All right, welcome Gadfly subscribers. This is Carlos, aka CJ. I want to thank you for subscribing to the Gadfly, and we're here today with a very special broadcast where we're going to do a subscriber Q&A and then also just go through and do a contributor roundtable discussion. So excited today. We have Dr. Jim Willie of golden-jackass.com. We also have Ken Shotgun Jr. of shotguneconomics.com. We also have Paul of theseriousreport.com. And we can't forget about Rory of the Daily Coin and the Gospel News Network. Gentlemen, thank you for all joining today. Very excited for this. It's been a minute since we've all been together, so I'm very excited for this, and I want to welcome you to our live stream.
Morning, everyone.
Yes, thank you.
Hello.
Absolutely. Well, let's jump right into it. And I thought for today's flow, I definitely want to get to the subscriber questions, and there's quite a few in the forum, and then also people that are listening to the live stream. But I thought it was important because I know everyone wants to kick off the conversation, but I thought it would be important to do just kind of a 2-minute intro, just in terms of just your perspectives on on a few things, jump into the questions, and obviously we can get more robust at the tail portion of it. So let's start with just a real quick 2-minute intro, and we're going to start with you, Jim. If you could go first, please.
Oh, okay. Well, pardon me. I just sat down after being out. Have to clear my throat. I've got a couple things on my mind, and they're both interrelated. One is what I regard very, very likely to be multiple big bank failures happening, and they're all being kept quiet because they're all systemically important financial institutions. Sci-fi, that's not science fiction, but we're kind of in a science fiction world here. I've got a short list. I've been saying for quite some time that we're facing something 3 to 5 times bigger than Lehman. Therefore, we're going to have 3 to 5 times as many failed big banks. Back then, it was Lehman and Fannie Mae. Now I think it might be Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, JP Morgan, at least those 3. Maybe add on HSBC, maybe add on Citigroup, maybe add on Wells Fargo. And it's all tied together with the outstanding astonishing repo volume that has reached in the last month. It's gone from 40 to 60 billion a night of repo, which is a 24-hour loan. I'm sure they're rolled over. And it's now gone to over $250 billion a day. And it's showing up on the Fed's balance sheet while they claim it's not QE, which means they're big fat liars. Okay, so we've got infinite QE, which I believe is forever. And we got multiple big bank failures, which I think are happening. And you can only take a guess whether it's gold derivatives, petrodollar derivatives, or interest rate derivatives that's causing it all. That's my piece.
Wow, a lot said there. Thank you for that, Jim. Ken, go for it, please.
Yeah, the 2 primary things I really wanted to take a look at was the repo market. Obviously, Jim's got the 250 billion number. I had heard yesterday it was 190 billion, but think about this, everyone. That's $1 trillion a week. $1 trillion a week. That's going to be now infinite. Also, Jim, the 2 banks I had heard were Citi and Deutsche.
Okay.
So you've got, like I said, you've got some insight to some other
We're
ones.
overlapped. That's good, Ken.
Yep. And then the more interesting thing has been, take a look at what Christine Lagarde mentioned in her first week in the office of the ECB. She not only says that the world needs to go to further negative rates, but she is pulling out she's channeling her John Maynard Keynes and saying that savers are bad and everyone needs to spend every cent they have, which tells you right there that they are going to go as much full bore, whether it comes to fruition or not. They want to bring in the digital system. They want to bring in the negative interest rates to infinity and destroy savings as we know it. So they've thrown out capitalism. There's no more capitalism. It's going to just be, in their minds, an eternal credit system. And the repo is going to be where the banks are just going to have to, they're going to try to survive the too big to fail banks, because that's the ones who are going to be running the show if they have their way. I don't think it's going to be able to matter, because once the collapse comes, confidence in the banks is going to be gone, and gone for decades. What we have after that, we'll have to find out.
Yeah, very well said. Very well said. Paul, go for it, please.
It's hard not to echo what's already been said. I think we've kind of crossed the Rubicon, though, where I think since 2008, the banks to varying degrees have been bailed out multiple times, but I think it's now got to the point where you could bail them out in the past and they'd be okay for 6 months or a year. Now they're not all right for 6 hours or 6 days. So hence the repo, it's going to just keep escalating. It will end up at some point, I said before we went live, I think it will end up at 300 billion a day, 400, 500, 600, whatever it takes to keep the entire nonsense going. In terms of what banks, I think all the banks are in major difficulties in the West, but some may be considerably more than others. And there's probably one or two big surprises in there that maybe we're not aware of at the moment, who have serious problems. But I've said for the last few weeks on and off, I think JP Morgan's in big trouble, but I don't rule out any of the big banks being in trouble. I know Deutsche is an obvious one we always pick on, and I'm not doubting that either. But I think effectively we've just reached the point where it's QE on steroids. It's just the utter destruction of the dollar. And although I keep seeing all these people trying to convince me that the dollar's going to survive because we can just devalue it 20% and everything's going to be fine, without seeming to bear any understanding of what the ramifications of that's going to be, I would share Jim's sentiment. It's impossible to know precisely why the banks need such enormous amounts of money just to be bailed out to keep going, but it's probably just every single nonsensical derivative market that has ever existed is just blowing up, and hence why you just need this infinite source of money just to keep things going. How long it will carry on before it completely implodes is anyone's guess, and it doesn't really matter. The point is, we know the dollar's dead, we know it's game over, and people need to prepare for the future and to take the necessary steps to alleviate their entire wealth. Although a lot of people don't have any wealth, but whatever you have to preserve that. And I don't think anywhere in history have we had an example of where it's been that obvious what's coming. And for anybody who pays any attention to it will know precisely, even though, as I say, there's a lot of people out there in the alt media who are still trying to sell the idea the dollar will survive. And I think I don't think anybody inside Wall Street believes it anymore. I don't think anyone inside the banks do. And certainly no one in the central banks believes it, despite all the hot air that they keep pumping out on a weekly, monthly basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well said, Paul. Roy, go for it.
Well, just as a reminder, when Christine Lagarde was the managing director of the IMF back in 2017, I believe it was, 2017, 2016, she made it very clear, and she actually said point blank that she wanted to see a digital currency at the central bank level. So that would support what Ken was saying as far as them pushing us towards a digital currency with all this repo madness, all this just ludicrous, everything that you guys have all just laid out. So I think that's coming next. I mean, I believe that there's what's called FedCoin. I believe that that's coming. I've talked about it on a number of occasions, the China's digital currency, and it's now, DCEP, DCEP, that's supposedly coming next, and Facebook's Libra coin, that's not completely dead at this point, but it's pretty close. So we've got these different digital currencies that are on the cusp or either just waiting for the situation to change. And when you're talking about it doesn't really matter if it's 190 billion or 250 billion a day. when you're talking about those kind of numbers on a daily basis, we've entered the twilight zone, as you were somebody referenced. That should be our theme music, is the theme from the Twilight Zone. And I wanted to read this because that's where we're at. I mean,
I agree.
Really is.
I agree.
I flipped over to the Gateway Pundit to see what was going on with the charade going on in the Senate, and their top article is a quote from Devin Nunes, and it says, "How is it possible for chairman to block questions of a person he claims not to know?" And for those that have been following the impeachment fiasco, that's the ideal question. I mean, but I'm not going to focus on that at all. I just thought that was interesting. What I'm looking at is a couple of different things. Of course, gold, and the fact that Turkey is just in Q3, Turkey acquired more gold than Russia and China both, and for the first time they have really stepped up what they're doing. And as you all know, on Monday, Trump met with Erdogan while the impeachment fiasco was going on one side of Washington, D.C. He was meeting with Erdogan on the other side, and it's really interesting to see what's going on in this dynamic between President Trump and the rest of the government. I mean, you have these two different dynamics going on, and it plays into everything that you guys were just talking about as far as the repo madness and what's going on with the obvious death of the dollar. I mean, if the dollar's not dying at 190 to 250 billion dollars a day, then I don't know how you can kill it. I mean, because that's just, I mean, it's numbers that I can't even fathom. I mean, $1 trillion a week, any way you slice it. So,
but this is no QE, Ken. I'm sorry, Rory. No QE. Yeah,
no,
right.
It's not QE, regardless of what. No,
what is it? You know what it is?
What
This is the manifestation of modern monetary theory, and you're watching it live.
Yep, it is. Gentlemen, was I the only one finding it real hard not to jump into the openings with some type of commentary? That was very challenging, but I'm proud of all of you for not doing that. we stuck to the format a little bit, and here's why. Because I think it was just so important from a perspective of thanking our Gadfly subscribers, and we wouldn't be doing what we're doing today without their support, and that's why I strategically and specifically put for the second portion of our live stream into the discussion that we're going to be having today. And I want to jump over to the questions in the Gadfly forum. And again, this is where our subscribers can post questions. So we put this out a couple of days ago. And one of the first questions came from Leo. And anyone's welcome to jump in on this. But the first question is, and this comes from Leo, can I get a Gadfly definition of neoliberal economic policies? I know the definition has changed, but what is it now? Who would like to take that on?
I'll go quick. Let me just go quickly.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Neoliberal economic policy, that's Reich economics. It's the revival of pure fascist economic policy. I might add something later, but others can pitch in here now.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, if you think about it, classical liberalism was really the foundation of capitalism. You had John Stuart Mills. You had all of those from the late 1700s, early 1800s, which brought in the thoughts of freedom and liberty, and that's the original classical liberalism. Neoliberalism is taking it post John Maynard Keynes into this. Now, Keynes, of course, really, if you want to think about it, is the father of creditism. And today, the neoliberalism has taken that into what we might consider modern monetary theory.
Excellent. Very good. Great question. Thank you, Leo, for that. And then also real quick from from G, not really necessarily just a question, but just, looking forward to discussion. So thank you for that comment. We appreciate that.
Carlos, can I do a little addendum?
Yeah, go for it.
I thought there'd be more contributions there. When I refer to Reich economics, I'm talking about bank fraud. I'm talking about accounting fraud. I'm talking about liberalized, falsified accounting with government blessing. I'm talking about theft by the banks behind the scenes. I'm talking about hidden props to the whole system. I'm talking about lies on the economic activity, joblessness, inflation, and GDP. All three are gigantic lies. I'm talking about falsified debt rating agency for evaluating the quality of debt. Reich economics is part of this neoliberal attitude applied to the financial structures in the economy. And it's all an extension of what we saw 70 and 80 years ago. We are now living in the Fourth Reich.
Excellent. Thanks, Jim, for adding on to that. The next question comes from Ronan, and his question or her question is on the missing 21 trillion. Where did it all go? This sounds like a silly question, but it's an unfathomable amount of money. What projects, assets has that money funded?
Everything.
The deep space program, underground tunnels, the DUMBs, the D-U-M-B, the deep underground military bases, the network of 500-mile-an-hour trains, narcotics distribution center costs, bribery for foreign officials, a lot of different things, but they're mostly hidden from view. So, you can't say, well, I looked it up and here it is. No, there's no such thing.
Well,
it's also bank bailouts.
We'll go Paul, and then Roy. Go ahead, Paul.
No, I was just saying it's bank bailouts as well. They've used that money to prop banks up. They use it to overthrow nations that they no longer like, who disassociate themselves from the dollar. So it's used to, anything just to prop up the current, deep state cabal apparatus across the globe. So yes, it will finance all the really nasty, horrible things that we've talked about as well. It doesn't mean it's all being spent, of course, and it's probably, though, considerably more than 21 trillion. I've often said I think it's at least 100 trillion, and it may be 200 trillion. It sounds unbelievable, but I think that's all we know is at least 21 trillion. But yeah, it's been used to fund every cabal entity all over the planet who are trying to destabilize governments, because let's face it, they're doing it in every nation on the planet except maybe 2 or 3 of them. It might not necessarily seeking to overthrow them, but they're certainly meddling in China, they're meddling in Russia, and these things cost a huge amount of money if you do it over who knows how many countries. I sort of slightly exaggerate, because there's certain countries it'd be absolutely pointless to do it. But yes, and I don't doubt banks have been bailed out repeatedly in the last decade to the tune of trillions of dollars.
Well, derivatives
and over a 10-year period, that's not really that much.
The derivatives.
Yeah.
I think it's $1 trillion a month, and has been for many, many years. I just made an argument yesterday. We saw a reduction from 1.4 quadrillion in total derivative count. That was about 4 or 5 years ago. That's 1,400 trillion. And now the general estimate is, well, it's been reduced. Now it's 700 trillion. Okay, well, that took place during 70 months. 700 trillion down in 70 months. Is that not 10 trillion a month?
Yeah, on average, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, this 21 trillion is laughable. They put that out so we can focus on it and make fun of it and criticize it and bring our questions and have our conjecture and a little bit of analysis. And I think it's 10 times bigger.
Yep, absolutely.
I've gotten. I know, Rory. Do you want to add something? Because I have something I want to throw in there as well.
Well, I was going to say probably a lot of it's being hidden in the ESF, and there's no telling what exactly what that's funding, because they have no reporting to anybody. They're not held accountable. And my guess is that all of the AI that we know about and that we don't know about, that's coming about through DARPA and some of their other entities, Raytheon and these guys, I would imagine that a significant amount of the $1 trillion a month, which that's probably a low estimate there, Jim. That's probably a significant amount of it is probably going to those types of programs.
Yeah, but it comes to 10 trillion a year.
Here's the other thing. How much money have they really wasted on the F-35?
Exactly. Jeez. Oh, $400,000 helmets. That's what they admit to.
You know, I mean, and numerous other failed projects that we've never heard about.
Hey, let's not have mockery of these people, because I've got a $200 toilet seat and I love it, and so does my butt.
Hey, you know, the one thing that stood out to me is obviously these are only numbers that were on government websites that they used forensic accounting to be able to figure out. But the point is that what two places did most of the money come or show up? It was in the Pentagon, and it was in housing and urban development. I'm focused on the housing and urban development. They're more than just Section 8 housing. They deal with grants to community organizers. And you have to wonder, when we started seeing more and more of this activism take place in the United States, where the hell did the funding come from? It couldn't have come just from Soros and his thing. There's just too many people. It's too widespread and it's too proliferated. So I'm wondering if a lot of the money that was funneled came from HUD down to the local levels to bribe officials, to pay off officials, also to get people off the street into this activism that's really the core of the division here in the United States.
So you're saying that the prosecutor that is now corrupt to the core in Philadelphia could have been funded by this, and all of the lawlessness that just passed in the state of Virginia. Virginia is now basically a lawless state because of the election that just happened. So all of that, and that makes perfect sense, Ken, because you're right. All of this activism that we've seen, all of the programs that are going on the West Coast from north to south, all of that, you're right. Soros couldn't possibly fund all of that, but that money is coming from somewhere.
Yep. Gentlemen, let's move on to the next question. And I'm going to kind of group these next two questions together. They're both from Matt. And I think this is a great question in terms of what a lot of our listeners, the people who have been listening to our advice in terms of purchasing, gold, all those things. So Matt asked the question, is storing precious metals outside of the U.S. with worldwide vaulting providers that are domiciled in the U.S. safe? So in other words, let's say that I have metal stored in a vault in Singapore or Switzerland, but the vaulting provider is actually domiciled in the U.S. Will there be any chance of confiscation or foul play when the collapse happens? Any thoughts or comments?
My thoughts on that are, is if it's not in arm's reach, then it's questionable. I personally, I trust James Turk. I like James Turk, but I'm not going to use that service simply because I don't know what's going to happen within any government. They all have the potential to turn tyrannical in a moment's notice, every single one of them, and shut down whatever it is that they see where they can confiscate someone's wealth. Now, what does that mean to Matt? I'm not sure how that's going to impact him and his wealth. I don't know. I know that I don't trust any of them. And I tell everybody this. It's not that I don't trust you. I don't trust anybody except for my wife. That's it. So why would I trust someone outside of myself or my wife with my wealth. I'm not going to do it. I'm just not. I mean, that's been my stance as long as I've been in this since 2008, 2009.
Yep. Okay. All right. Anyone else on that?
I trust Hong Kong, and there's something that people need to keep in mind that goes counter to what has been said up to this point. I don't care where the headquarters is for the company that owns the trucks. I care about where the vaults are located, and people need to understand that bullion banks and vaulting, not services, vaulting locations are sovereign nations. So I like Hong Kong, and I've noticed that, when I came across maybe 100 different stories and many, many photos, I don't see any demonstration at the Hong Kong airport for the gold and silver vaulting facilities. It's the banks, it's the trains, it's the supermarkets and other places like that. When I talk with Marco Byrne, who's the founder and head of Goldcore, we had a long discussion 3 or 4 months ago, and he said, Jim, Zurich is the best. Zurich in Switzerland is honorable, and they're solid as a rock. You just have to stay away from the various Swiss ETF funds that lie, like the Canton Fund, ZKB. These vaulting services differ in their jurisdictions. I would not want to have my money sitting in a London vault, but I would not be bothered at all if it were Dublin, Ireland. Now, if Marco Byrne, who is a solid expert, like Zurich, then I think Zurich is good too. I've got indication, and the voice has what's the word? Confirmed that Hong Kong is still solid. I don't like a number of different jurisdictions, and I don't believe that if it's farther than your arm, then it's not safe. I know somebody who put it in his Atlanta backyard, and it's not safe there because he cannot retrieve it because his divorced wife will watch. And you can't. I just don't trust having it in the basement. Now maybe in a hidden lakeside cottage, you got a basement vault. Okay, that's fine. That's good. But there's a lot of, I think, very spurious comments made about this topic. I like Zurich, I like Hong Kong, and I'm not really sure about the rest.
Thank you for that. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, my thoughts on this, especially one, notice there's no absolutes in the world. If you go in with that mindset, then what you're just doing is you're looking for the best practices according to the best information. For me, because I don't want to give financial advice, for me, I keep some gold and silver. I keep a little bit of cash, not a lot. And, anything outside of that, I want to keep outside of the jurisdiction of the United States at this point. Now, obviously, we've mentioned James Turk Gold Money. There's also McIlvaney, who has a vaulting scheme that, and I use scheme lightly because that's a British term, which doesn't necessarily mean nefarious. They have vaulting in places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai. What you're going to find is with Asia, with China and Russia wanting to move into the superpower playing field, they're going to hold integrity when it comes to international contracts. They're not going to be like the United States who creates FACTA to try to get it not only international players but also you, me, and anybody else who has a bank account offshore. Holding it in foreign places that are outside of the Western control is probably about 90 to 95% secure. There's nothing that's going to be 100% secure. So with this being said, there are alternatives now, especially with technology. The world is a smaller place. You don't have to physically be at a place to access your money. So do your due diligence. Ask the tough questions. Make sure you go in there with all the questions that you want and all the things that you need, and then find the best place to go ahead and do that.
Paul, anything to contribute to that?
Yeah, I think Ken made a great point at the end. It's kind of, I don't necessarily treat it on a nation by nation basis. I mean, I might argue I wouldn't keep my precious metals in the US, but there are sources and places in any country where it's going to be perfectly safe. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to eliminate certain nations on that basis. And that's would be my reasoning. Wherever you are in the world, if that's what you want to do and you want to buy gold and silver, then, you know, as Ken rightly says, do your research, find a place that you know is going to be secure. And believe it or not, some of the places which people would think would be confiscated straight away isn't going to happen. You could, not that you would necessarily, or you would even be able to, but if you went to the Bank of England and they were able to put your precious metal there, it's not going to get stolen. And this is the point. It's kind of, you have to do your research. I'm not saying people can put it there, but I'm using that as a somewhat of a flippant argument that says it doesn't matter. There might be places. I mean, I tend to share Jim's sentiment. I don't think I'd want to store my precious metals in London, but there might be places in the UK where you could do it and they'll be perfectly safe. Now, it doesn't mean you necessarily always would have access to those places. It depends on what you know and who you know, but there are always safe places in all jurisdictions. But I do agree with Jim as well that despite what the fiasco of what's going on in Hong Kong, yeah, I don't doubt precious metals there are quite safe. And I wouldn't have any problems about putting them somewhere in China or sticking them even in Russia, because they're not going to get stolen. But there are certain nations that clearly you wouldn't put them in. But I think you have to be extremely cautious about following a sort of general rule as to where you should put them, where you shouldn't. And it is, do your due diligence, make sure you understand and you talk to whoever you're going to buy it from, and make sure there's always transparency. And the obvious question is, you're going to say, okay, well, I want to come and see my precious metal next week. And if you get objections, then you know there's a problem. I mean, there's a lot of very obvious things that we all need to ask ourselves in that regard. And I'm assuming it's still available. I think it was public one. I think what Jim did with Marco Byrne talking about all this is probably something people should refer back to and listen, because Mark's in that environment, he understands it, and rather like Jim, I've got a lot of time for him, and I think that's worth listening to. That will give you some advice and ideas as to how you should plan accordingly.
Gentlemen, let me go ahead and pivot to the next question, because it kind of goes that same direction. And then if you had something else you want to contribute to that gold storage, go right ahead. But this also comes from Matt, and it's a great question. And Matt asked the question: the Shanghai Gold Exchange granted the CME Group a license to use, create, and list future contract based on the Shanghai Gold benchmark PM price. Does this indicate we will continue to see more downward precious metal price manipulation post-dollar collapse, or after all the metals have been drained from the west to east? Thank you. So I think that's a very thought-provoking question in regards to the CME and the future contracts based on the SG. So what are your guys' thoughts on that?
This is Jim. I'll pitch in. There's a lot of unknown. Whenever it comes to China and high finance matters, you have to be very careful. You can't say, oh, China's doing this or that. No, you don't know what China's doing. They might do something in the next 3 months, but have a 5 or 10-year plan that you have no idea about. So when people told me, gosh, we got China now, they got their foot in the door at the CME, they're now in league with the bad guys. I thought, well, that's too simplistic. That's basic 80 IQ baby Bush kind of thinking. We don't know. Maybe they're trying to get in there in order to prevent some of the chicanery going on. Maybe they've decided the only way to have a legitimate gold market in the next several years is to tie in with the evil gang and tie their hands and block their channels and wreck their gears. So we don't know. I don't know. I do know that the Chinese have been belly aching for years that we've artificially kept the price of gold down. They don't like it because they're the biggest holders. They never admit, but I've got it on good authority that the White Dragons have 110,000 tons of gold. And now there's a lot of bickering and debate about how much the Chinese central bank has. Is it 2,000 tons or is it 1,500 tons? No, it's more like 25 or 30,000 tons, you idiot. I'm so tired of stupidity when it comes to Chinese and other central bank tallies for their gold. They put out something for public digestion, which the small minds chew on endlessly. We don't know what the Chinese are up to. They launched the SGE, and they've not been able to bring about a real big lift in the gold price, but they did break it out of that above that 1,400 limit, and now something has happened, and we got a stall, and we don't know whether we're going to continue up to 1,700 and challenge the 1,900. We don't know what the Chinese are doing. And anyone who claims to know easily, without putting a lot of thought, without making a lot of contacts and gathering information, and without actually talking to someone who is Chinese, I think it's all silly guesswork. I think the Chinese are trying to keep their enemies close by their side so they can watch what they do and block it.
I've got a couple of thoughts on this, and it might be in relation to what happened about a month ago. I believe the LME tried to purchase, wasn't it the LBMA? The LME is already now a part of the London Gold Pool, which determines the price fix. But I think they were trying to buy or merge with a big Western gold market. With that being said, the thing that stood out the most was the gold market then would be traded in London and in Hong Kong 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By having the COMEX tied to the SGE, what it does is it allows for Asia to trade in the U.S. markets 24 hours, 7 days a week, and vice versa, or whenever the gold markets are open. What in the end, the benefit for China is it's going to make faster the arbitrage of gold going east and currency going back, fiat going back west. I think that's really the whole purpose behind that, only because I tie it in with what the LME tried to do by taking over London's market. So that's just my thoughts on that.
Well, let me add to that because you make a great point. The Chinese are tired of lifting the gold price during our night, the American U.S. night, and then it's good morning New York, which means it's down 10 or 20 bucks. They're tired of that. So if they link the two, they might be able to eliminate the up in Asia, down in New York effect, level it out, and that's part of what I'm describing about jamming their gears and stuffing their channels so they don't work anymore.
But how does the fact that the Shanghai Gold Exchange is a physical market and the CME is a paper market, that doesn't level, or does it? I mean,
Rory, it would do, because if they grant them a license to create and list futures contracts, they'll say to the CME, but the difference is on the Shanghai Gold Exchange, every 1 ounce contract is backed by physical metal. So you want to list contracts, it has to be backed by physical metal, not the paper fiasco. So in a way, it's kind of forcing the CME to start to be more accountable for how they're not just paper-based contracts. And of course, it does. It extends the base and the scope of the Shanghai Gold Exchange, which is what they want to do. So I share Jim's view. It is very simplistic to just go, it's this world we live in the West where we always go, well, if you talk to the enemy, then you must be the enemy. Well, no. As Russia have proved and China have proved, if you want to change things in the world, you have to go and talk to these enemies, and eventually they stop being your enemy. Look at Turkey with Russia. That's a great example. And that's where everyone in the West gets bogged down in this idea. So no, the fact they've granted them a license is forcing the CME to say, okay, well, you have access to a bigger market, but by the way, we're not having this paper nonsense. You're going to have to back it. It's going to be backed by physical metal. And someone's made the point, are we going to see more downward pressure? Well, for 6 years, I've said, You will never see a proper breakout of the gold price until the West is drained of gold. And I'll stand by that, and I'll never waver on that, because I don't care whether the gold's at 1,400 now or 1,300. And in some ways, I don't think it matters to China in one sense, and it's irrelevant, because in the opaque gold market, the price of gold is not the gold price. If you want to go and buy tonnage, you're not going to be paying $1,465 an ounce, which it is currently, or even 15, or even 18, and maybe not even 2,000, and maybe even higher. So it doesn't really matter in some senses to them what the price is. When it will change is when the gold's drained, the West's drained of gold, the paper markets will implode. Then the real markets backed by physical metal, such as the Shanghai Gold Exchange, will come to fruition. Then you'll see the acceleration of the price, and it'll be at the point when it really matters. Because at the moment, if you're in accumulation mode, it doesn't matter. But at some point, when the paper market's destroyed, then you'll start to begin to see gold and silver, the most undervalued assets I think, in history, and silver more than gold, will start to realize maybe something approximating to where they should be. And equally, for me, silver gets interesting. Maybe when it hits $50, $60, $70 an ounce, then I might be interested. And if gold gets to 2000, 2001, then it gets interesting. It's just noise at the moment, and let them mess around with it with their paper. Let them, produce contracts that is like the entire silver supply in a few hours with some on top. Let them do it. It doesn't matter, because ultimately they're accelerating their own demise.
Yes,
Paul, you make a great point when you talk about merging the two, and Rory, you too. If China wants to merge their legitimate physical-backed Shanghai exchange with the illegitimate paper-backed New York and London exchange, I applaud that move, because it's kind of like rock and scissors. Rock beats scissors, and the Chinese hold the rock. Let them mix the two and watch the paper fraud be exposed and have severe problems. I think the Chinese are trying to meld the two and infiltrate the Western side in order to expose it, lock it up, and reform it.
And I agree completely with that. And the reason that I say that is because the contract that has been agreed upon, there's no physical involved with it. It is a cash settled contract, period. There's no physical metal involved with this new contract. So that in itself says that there's a problem, to me anyway. It says that not that China is kowtowing to the CME. I think that what you guys are saying is exactly right, that it's a way for them to keep an eye on what's going on and to open up a dialogue. And it allows China to accumulate through the safe accounts, the SAFE accounts, more physical gold at much better price point than 2,000 or 2,500. I'd much rather get, a bunch of gold at 1,400 than 2,500. I mean, that just makes sense. So I think that's in large part that plays a part in what we're seeing play out here. And I think also what you were saying a moment ago, Jim, as far as the Shanghai Gold Exchange now having an influence on the CME, on the COMEX, that it very well could be the driving force that helps to push gold to a much higher point. I think that it only stands to reason, because if you're moving 50 plus tons of physical gold a week through the Shanghai Gold Exchange, then that's got to play, that has to be at some point influence what's going on in the paper market, even though they dumped 3.3 million paper ounces on the market just last week or earlier this week, whenever that last big smash was. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But so I agree with what you guys are saying. I just think that it's it's going to be interesting to see what happens over the next year as the mining production changes and starts really the problems with within the mining industry over the next 2 to 3 years in particular start really coming to the surface.
Let me pose one more little item in there that could possibly happen. It could be that some very big Chinese buyers are fed up with the rollover with cash and the rollover into the next contract. March, June, September, December. We might see a lawsuit from a Chinese entity that JP Morgan presents because JP Morgan is their now lackey. JP Morgan is a Chinese lackey. Don't ever forget that the Chinese bought the JP Morgan headquarters for a ridiculously low price. It might have been the final payment, I realize that, but they bought the JP Morgan headquarters, and they bought the JP Morgan vault, and they bought the JP Morgan complex, and I think JP Morgan is now their boy. So let's watch to see if a big Chinese entity files a lawsuit and now has access to more information to make it a more solid and legitimate lawsuit now that they've got that link. There's so many angles to this, it's almost funny.
Yeah, I think in part maybe even a follow-up discussion as well. I want to switch gears real quick, and this is just kind of a one-off question real quick for you, Paul, and this comes from Michelle. She said that London Paul put out on Twitter a while ago asking subscribers if they would be interested in a newsletter or a book about quote-unquote after the reset. I can't remember if that's the correct title. I was wondering if something that will come to fruition.
Yes, it kind of we kind of being stalled a bit because, as you all know, I had 100 million things to deal with for the last 3 years, and we kind of thought things were settling down. And to be honest, they have. It's just a lot of bureaucratic stuff now. But hopefully, within the next 2 or 3 weeks, that will all be finished, and then I'll have time, sort of after sort of the new year, to get that finished off. To be honest, Lisa's done a lot of work on it, and it's down to me to be able to spend a bit of time, but it's just one of those things. So yes, it will be coming out at some point next year, and so yeah, I apologize that, but I don't want to go on about personal things, but it has been extremely busy time for a very long time. But
right.
That's just life, and it's the same for everybody.
Okay. Well, Paul, now that it's on Twitter, it's now also in a recording too. So, okay. Real quick, this next two question, or one of them is more than a comment and then question, comes from Suk Lee. And I think this is a question that a lot of people are asking, and that's in regards to the Hong Kong protest. And her specific question is how does London Paul? Well, it's for everyone. See the Hong Kong violent protest by the students play out. It's obvious the violence has accelerated and paralyzed the economy of Hong Kong and terrorized many non-protesters living in Hong Kong. Her question is, at what point will China step in, maybe behind the scenes, to push back the US and UK, who are obviously behind these violent and deadly protests? And then the second part of her question is the cabal getting desperate and ramping up all these protests worldwide? And her other comment was just, and I agree, is in regards to witnessing this and, seeing this being played out, and more importantly for the non-protesters and the people who are just trying to, make a living and get by in Hong Kong. So let's open up that conversation in regards to what point will China step in?
Well, I covered this.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Jim, go on. You can.
No, I just wanted. They already have. Go ahead, the other guys.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I covered this off in my own podcast yesterday and made some comments on it, but I don't often repeat things. But I suppose I'm going to have to, because otherwise we can't answer the question. With regards to, we all know, yes, of course, it's Western meddling, and I think I think there's US and UK influence. People may say I'm biased, but I think it's slightly more US than UK, but most definitely there's Western influence that has fueled what's going on. It has absolutely paralyzed the economy. We said before we came on air that Hong Kong's economy contracted 3.2%. That's officially in Q3, which probably means it's about 4 or 5% in reality. China's intelligently done the right thing, because what the US particularly wanted China to do was send the troops in, and then they could tell the world, look how aggressive China is, and it was all designed to try and sow seeds of doubt in the world as to China's aggressive imperialism, even though that applies to the US more than any other nation. Of course, intelligently, China didn't. And I kind of put something slightly cryptic out on Twitter the other day, and I wrote an article 2 years ago, or over 2 years ago, about Shenzhen. And part of the reason Shenzhen was put there was for this very scenario, because China knew one day the risk was Hong Kong could go into utter meltdown. For this very reason, it put Shenzhen there so it can just move things over the border very seamlessly. Personally, I think Hong Kong's finished. I think it's in utter meltdown. I don't think it will recover for a very long time. The Chinese are telling all their Chinese nationals to get out of there. I think they're just going to leave it to utterly just be ground into dust. And China will just move operations to Shenzhen. Already, a lot of US banks are moving personnel out of Hong Kong into China, into Singapore, into places. I mean, we could be completely wrong here, but it looks as though China's just washed their hands and said, well, if you want to destroy it, because we don't need it anymore, we'll just move the operation. When someone says, is the cabal getting desperate? Absolutely. Hence Bolivia, hence Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba. The list goes on and on. They're so desperate that they're just trying anything and everything to disrupt the other nations in some vain hope of retaining any relevance. Meanwhile, of course, the US dollar's vaporizing before our very eyes. But no, I don't think China particularly needs to or wants to get involved, because it's not going to do the very thing the US wants, which is to play them as the bogeyman and then say to the world, well, see, you can't trust them. If you don't do what they say, then they'll come in and take over you militarily. This is why the Belt and Road's a complete farce. And so why would you do that? Why risk it? And that's why Shenzhen was built as much as anything else, was for the very day. And they knew Hong Kong would be a hot potato at some point after they took it back in 1997. But it's very clear the US wants them to act. If China goes in militarily, it'll be on par with Trump's idea of a trade war with China. It'd be absolutely reckless, stupid, and farcical if they do, and I don't see why they'll do that. But that's what I think will pan out. It's very, very regrettable for Hong Kong itself, but in the end, it's going to just turn into a ghost town where, I mean, nothing there. All the financial institutions will pull out. Everything in the end will have to pull out, and what's going to be left? A bunch of students fighting with who exactly? And I think maybe it will hopefully fizzle out before we get to that, because the US will realize this is farcical and they'll pull the plug on the funding. And once the funding goes, very quickly these protests will stop, but they've most certainly escalated and they are extremely violent. I mean, we've seen some pretty graphic stuff with regards to what's being done, and you cannot possibly manage that sort of protest. But what I said before I came on air, this is indicative of what is going to happen to certain cities across the Western world, big major cities, if what we expect to happen and believe will happen in terms of economic meltdown. It won't be exactly the same and for the same reasons, but this is the kind of problems we're going to see in areas of large population. And in a way, it's a bit of a forewarning as to those scenarios also.
One of the things that
you go ahead.
Jim. Okay.
No, let me be brief. I don't have a lot to say. I have, 3 different comments. They're all short, and then you can go, Ken. The Chinese have been really angry at HSBC for some time. They've been trying in the last year or two to alter their board. The HSBC is probably the biggest bank, and it's got British roots in Hong Kong. The Chinese have been trying to get resignations of board members, and they've only had one or two from what I hear. There could be more in the last few months. HSBC is the biggest bank in Hong Kong. The Chinese want to take it over. And I think that, no one really thinks that the Chinese are instigating some of this. Everybody's, and me too. I've been saying for a long time, the MI6 and Langley folks are funding with Soros help. And I even have a client whose son was paid $100 a day. The father's a doorman. The son is out there demonstrating, yelling, and holding a placard. But the Chinese, I think, might want to see some disruptions too until maybe HSBC does relent. Now, Paul, you mentioned Shenzhen. They've got a twin city. They got a twin city for Hong Kong, and they're trying to make it inside China to serve pretty much the same function. And then if it works and it all hums along within the Chinese economy and financial system, they don't really need Hong Kong. So, I don't think it's going to be turned to dust. I think we might actually see a movement toward independence, which would be a shocking development. And the third thing is, this comes directly from Hetrick letter clients. The initial violence and organization was the Vietnamese in Hong Kong, and no one ever talks about them. They're funded, they're angry, and they're not considered to be, ordinary type citizens. They're like outsiders. They came in during the post-Vietnam War era in the 70s and 80s, and they're not equal. They're discriminated against, and they're treated like, second-class citizens, minorities, and they're the ones who started some of the demonstrations. They're the ones who were the most violent. So, you got HSB, you got Shenzhen, and you got the Vietnamese. There's so many different angles of this, but I really like to see if there was a movement toward independence. Wouldn't that be shocking?
Obviously when Hong Kong started, we saw that picture of some of the student leaders speaking with the ambassador of the United States and in discussion. So the question of whether this was a Western-led revolt is obviously there. To me, there are a couple key things that make Hong Kong a perfect storm. Hong Kong has no manufacturing. It is simply a financial hub, logistics hub, professional services hub. It doesn't have an industry that it can really boost, as we've seen on the in Shanghai and in the Chinese mainland that's brought up the people. So as a financial services hub, what else do they have? They have real estate. And we have seen, just like in Vancouver, just like in Moscow, just like in other places, the cost of living and the cost of real estate has skyrocketed so much, but wages haven't. So it's really become unaffordable for the vast majority of people who work on the or even go to school there to be able to afford rent, to be able to afford to live. That was, like they said, the perfect storm that allowed Western influences come in and get this revolt off the ground. The second thing is what's important is Hong Kong is referred to in regards to China as one state, two worlds. So they see themselves separate, just like Taiwan, separate of mainland China. And as such, you have a willing participants that would rather be more on the Western side, the old British influence, than they would on the communist Chinese side when it comes to that. So China, China's been working beneath the surface to aid the Hong Kong government in at least standing up to the protests. But if Hong Kong disintegrated into chaos, that too would also benefit Beijing.
Which means that they're going to come in. I mean, the Chinese, like pointed out, Paul, that they're already in there. And if you've seen any of the images coming out of there, it's really very disturbing what's going on. And what I wanted to add is that what we're seeing play out in Hong Kong is, in fact, coming to the Western world. I mean, look at what Trump just announced a couple of weeks ago, that he's giving another tranche of military equipment to the local police. Okay, he's not just doing that willy-nilly. I mean, this has been my complaint about Trump since day one, is his love of the police state. And this, they've already been given a bunch of military equipment. They already look like soldiers in the field. And what is getting ready to happen is that they're going to fill in all the gaps that were left over from the handout that was passed around. So they're getting ready, and it ties back into where we began this whole conversation, which is the 190 to 250 billion dollars a day. I mean, they know that things are falling apart. They can see it. We can see what's happening in Hong Kong. We can see how the satanic globalists, what their latest playground in Hong Kong, what they're doing there. We can see how that's playing out, and I personally believe that that's what we're going to see, that same type of scenario play out here as this whole collapse continues to ramp up. I mean, the closer that we get to the absolute end of the dollar experiment, the more that's going to be, that we're going to see that. I mean, we're already seeing the factions being developed, you know, the black and white, the immigrants versus natural born. I mean, we're seeing that play out all through the Western world, not just in the United States, but all across Europe as well. I mean, all of these things, all of the pieces are being put into place right now. So that's what we're seeing in Hong Kong and in some of the other uprisings that are a lot more violent. I believe that's what we're going, that's coming here a lot sooner than what we may be prepared for. So,
gentlemen, we've hit the hour mark. I want to get to the last question that comes from our YouTube stream, and then also obviously move into closing comments. I just want to be mindful of your time as well. The next question comes from Ebenezer, and his question is, what does Saudi Arabia's announcement of Aramco's IPO being available for domestic listing starting in December of this year mean to the petrodollar? And thank you for that question, Ebenezer.
Well, I guess it depends how much Chinese investment there is in the IPO. And that's open to conjecture. It's open to many things. I mean, the whole IPO is kind of, well, they're supposed to announce the price, the launch price shortly, but I mean, we all know really just that Aramco is massively overvalued. It's not worth $2 trillion. It's not worth 1.5. It's debatable whether it's worth $1 trillion. But I think if China takes a significant stake in it, which in this initial tranche of an IPO, which is just listing in Saudi Arabia, then that might be indicative, but of something far greater. But we know that China is obviously trading oil to some extent with the Saudis in the yuan. Of that, there is no doubt. It's debatable as to what extent they are actually doing that. But in terms of the IPO, I think it does depend. And there were rumors of China taking quite a significant chunk of the initial IPO, but it's yet to be confirmed whether that's the case. In some ways, I'd be quite surprised if they did. But if they do, I think it's very much indicative of the fact that if China's going to do it, maybe they'll just chuck 10 billion worthless dollars away just to destroy the petrodollar, and maybe that's what it takes. Maybe $10 billion will do it for the Saudis. Who knows?
I think in the end, it's gonna really be moot, because if the U.S. the domestic side, U.S. domestic side invests in the Aramco, it's going to be Wall Street. It's going to be corporations. It's not going to be the sovereign government. We don't really have a sovereign wealth fund outside of the PPT, ESFS. With that being said, all they care about is making money. They're not going to care about the politics of the petrodollar or the petro yuan. China on the other side, as Paul just mentioned, has several different wealth funds that are run by the government, and they use that for strategic purposes. The other side of the coin is what's really going to be put out there is only about 5 or 10% of stake in Aramco. So the Saudis are still going to have control over the primary corporation, and as such, they're going to keep their agreements of trading oil for yuan. They're going to kowtow to Russia, OPEC +1, and probably start moving more towards euros, de-dollarization. In the end, it's not going to matter.
Okay, I got a bit of a controversial point of view regarding Aramco. I've been saying for quite some time the IPO will not happen. I've been saying for quite some time that their actual Saudi oil reserves are 80% less than what they say. So let's just keep that in mind. 80 means 20% legitimate, 5-to-1 reality. They're trying to sell 10% of the proposed and purported value of Aramco. Paul, you're dead on. I don't think it's even worth 200 billion. There was some Exxon executive or former executive who came out and said, I think it might be worth, Aramco might be worth in the 300 billion range. So 7 times less than what they think of 200 billion. So here's what I think is going to happen. They're going to talk about selling 10% when they're actually going to sell 55 or 70% of the controlling interest, and Russia and China are going to take control of it and share it and run it. Because I got news for people who haven't figured this out yet. The Saudis are lazy, the Saudis are dumb, and the Saudis are corrupt. So they're going to need a new handler, and they're going to enlist the help of the Chinese and the Russians to run their entire show, because they don't know how to do it, and they're not willing to do it, and they don't have the capital to do it. In other words, nothing has changed in the last 50 years, except they're going to move out the Americans and British and move in the Russians and the Chinese. So the Russians and Chinese, RNC, are going to take control of 60 to 70% of Aramco and call all the shots, sell everything outside the dollar, and face Langley terrorist hits like what we saw 2 months ago.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Gentlemen, let's move into closing comments. We're going to go reverse order on this. So I'm going to start with Rory of the Daily Coin. So closing comments, please, Rory.
All right. Thank you, CJ. And thank you all to the Gadfly subscribers. Really appreciate all you guys. What I'm looking at is the end of the BRICS summit that's just wrapping up. And there's some information that has hit my desk earlier today. And I'm going to reach out to some people that I have in China, and then I have contact down in South America that I'm going to reach out to see if I can get some information that's a little closer at hand to the reporting. As far as something, there is no reporting in the United States, so anything that I can get from these folks, and I'm hoping to be able to bring something to you all in the early part or no later than mid next week on what I found out as far as some of the side conversations, some of the contracts that may have been signed. And there's already at least one piece of information that I just need to confirm before I discuss it. But that it looks like there's some really interesting meat on the bone that's coming out of the BRIC summit, and look for that next week.
Very well. Very well. Go ahead, Paul, you're up next.
I always think with these things, where do we start? I mean, there is 100 million plates spinning in 100 million different jurisdictions, and it's just a minefield of things to focus on and look at. And I mean, I don't want to get sort of bogged down in the day to day. Well, you know, with the US, is it 300 billion today with repo? Is it what? It doesn't really matter anymore. I hate to say this, I have to be extremely careful, but I've said this really for a long time. Most of the world doesn't really particularly interested in what the US does anymore. It's not interested in US foreign policy. It's not interested in what the dollar, it knows the dollar's dead. It knows the dollar's finished. The big reason why they started de-dollarizing, because they knew the US had printed 200 trillion, whatever it is, and went, what's the point? This is Zimbabwe on steroids. So I don't think the world's really that bothered. US militarily doesn't have any teeth anymore because the Russians have the hypersonic missiles. And notice they've just put the Su-57s. Well, they've admitted now that the Russian Air Force have them, even though they've had them for a while, and they can launch hypersonic missiles. That statement came out just to remind the Americans to behave themselves on the world stage. So, as ever, I think the big focal point is less, because there's just, all this internal squabbling in the US, frankly, is a waste of time. I'm not really going to bother commenting about this impeachment debacle, because it's he said, she said. It's like the Democrats think they're winning and the Republicans think they're winning, and none of them are winning. It's all an utter farce. It's a political system that everyone in the United States needs to say, this is ridiculous. Why are we paying any attention to it? Because none of it has any relevance. None of it is going to save the American people from what's coming. None of them are interested in saving the American people from what's coming. So I don't care about the day-to-day machinations of politics. It's rather like the UK and its general election. I don't care what anyone says. It's a waste of time. It's of no relevance. I don't care who wins the general election, because it doesn't change who governs the country for now. I'll only be interested in politics when someone actually is worth voting for, because they may actually do something. So for me, the big focus is, in a broad sense, what are we seeing? There are economic considerations. What are we seeing in terms of de-dollarization? But as ever, for me, the big interest is what's going on in the rest of the world. I don't mean that horribly with respect to the US, and even for the matter the UK. But they're really just broken, failed, and well, the UK empire failed a long time ago, but they're broken, failed nations that are going to have to go eat a lot of humble pie and decide to try and reinvent themselves as respectable custodians in the world. And at some point they will do that. But the real interest for me is what's the interesting things going on in the rest of the world. I'd like to think that Trump could do something, and I'm not going to completely give up on him at this point, although increasingly I don't see how he's going to be able to achieve any objectives. Quite interesting, actually. As a side note, just flashed up in mind, Roger Stone's being found guilty on 7 counts of obstruction and witness tampering, etc. Once I don't focus on policy, I think that may have some interesting ramifications, but we'll see what happens as a result of that. But it's a very interesting world. There's 100 million things to be, and it's impossible to focus on all of them. And I think that's why we all have to do the things we do, because hopefully we have a nice rounded picture on the Gadfly, because we all do different things, but we also complement each other. And that's really what it's about. It's understanding the reality and dealing with reality, and not all this nonsensical alt media rubbish about things that are happening and apparently are going to keep happening, but for 3 years, 2 years and 3 years have never happened. I'm tired of it. I'm fed up of hearing about it, and let's deal with reality, and let's give people an understanding, as we do, as to what is really going on.
Very well said. Jim, you're up next, please.
Okay. I think we're seeing a multitude of sideshows, and our guys have touched on this, and I'm gonna run with it. The sideshows are all over the place and trying to distract us from the real issue. The sideshows are Hong Kong. The sideshow is the impeachment. The sideshow is Venezuela. The sideshow is Iran. And the real action is several things. The real action is the gold and dollar issue. The dollar being rejected and gold coming to the fore. If they drive down the interest rates anymore in the United States, you're going to see central banks around the world ditching their treasuries and loading up on gold, according to the Basel Plan expressed 20 years ago by Chairman Zylstra. The other big issue we're getting distracted from is the big bank failures, and I think they're in progress now and being kept quiet. A big item that I did not touch on was Credit Suisse. I've got it on pretty good authority through a grapevine, 2 passes of information. Credit Suisse is having trouble unwinding their arbitrage positions, and it begs a lot of different questions. And I think it has to do with their Euro Swiss peg of 120 back in the year 2012. And they admitted that that was all integrated with the United States basis of dollar gold arbitrage. So it's the euro, the Swiss, the dollar, and gold all tied together. And whenever you hear they're having trouble unwinding it, you have to conclude that they're going to be having a risk. They're facing the prospect of the prices moving back to where they were before the arbitrage was put on, which is $1,900 gold. The other big distraction is we are being distracted from another major event, which is QE. We've got infinite QE forever right now. And, I was interested before this started where our guys would think the volume might go to. And it might double. It might double from here. And nobody's asking where does it go. Some do, but it's not a real common theme. We're being distracted from the story of the Saudis flipping east. I made my peace. I think the Russians and Chinese are going to grab controlling interest. The Saudis are going to lie and call it 10%. It's really going to be 55, 60, 70%. The Russians are going to manage the blending. They're going to manage the sales. It's going to be non-dollars. The Chinese are going to manage the payment systems in RMB, and the Saudis are going to face the utter wrath of Langley with more terrorist attacks like what we saw two months ago. The last piece we're being distracted from is the Belt and Road, which is looking at the possibility of nearly $1 trillion in finished trade this calendar year. I think the tremendous amount of treasury bonds are being used as indirect exchange in order to pay for a lot of projects. And, we don't get firm figures. The Chinese are in charge of it, but the guesses are $5, $6, $7 trillion worth of projects, multi-year commitments. So I'm tired of all the distractions. I think I've done a pretty good job in the last 15 and a half years pushing to the side what the distractions were and focusing on the real meat on the plate. We've got some very serious things happening. They are the golden dollar, the big banks, QE, the Saudis flipping, and the Belt and Road. And we haven't even talked about Germany flipping east during this entire hour. So it's really the Saudis and the Germans flipping east. And those are two of the biggest allies the United States has ever had outside of England.
Yep, absolutely. Ken, go for it.
10 years ago, 2009, the stock markets had finally bottomed at about 6,600 on the Dow, 660 or 670 on the S&P. Many people who had their retirements and 401ks and mutual funds in the stock markets saw a decline of between 40 and 60% of their value. Fast forward again today to now. Insiders have been selling for at least the last 2.5 years. They've kept the stock markets up, both in a combination of the PPT as well as the corporations buying back stock. But I've noticed a trend of the last 3 days. If you've been watching any of my market recaps, the equity markets end the day about as flat can be, including one day where the Dow had a 0.00% gain or a loss. It went down 1 point. The reality is that unless we go into hyperinflation, we are seeing really the top of the equity markets. They may go up a little bit more, it may go a little bit less. We already know that one of the key attacks that the Democrats want to do in the deep state is to kill the economy before the elections. With that being said, I got into a conversation yesterday on Twitter with somebody who was trying to promote holding equities. And the fact of the matter is that if you hold paper, you don't hold wealth. You do not make money until you sell your stocks. And I'm not saying this to sell your stocks, but if you're in the stock market, if you have a retirement fund, it is prudent, based on historical norms, you better be looking seriously at the question of, am I going to hold my wealth, or am I going to see it decline and try to chase the falling knife as it goes down? There are too many factors, especially with what the banks are dealing with, the potential for rehypothecation, and what the insiders, the rich people are doing with equities. Hedge funds are getting into cash. Warren Buffett isn't buying any new companies. These should be warning signals that now is the time, especially when everything is looking good, to be able to secure yourself in cash, in gold and silver, in anything that is outside of the paper markets, because they will collapse in an instant. And because of the fact that we have a history of seeing markets closed, seeing banks closed before you can get your money, if you don't take the time to prepare for what is coming with the writing on the wall, then see the potential for you to lose most of what you've worked for your entire life.
Very well said. Very well said. Gentlemen, thank you for an absolutely great discussion today. I truly enjoyed it. I know our Gadfly subscribers enjoyed it as well. Again, want to thank our Gadfly subscribers for all the great questions today. You can feel free to continue the conversation directly on this video or also in our forums. So Paul, Ken, Rory, Jim, thank you, gentlemen, so much for a great roundtable today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks, Gadfly, for 1 year of being a part of us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Take care, everyone. Be safe. Thank you.